Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Stephen Yates, former Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House. He goes over the beginning of the Afghanistan war, the debates around going into it, the withdrawal and the effects it has on the international stage, and some of the geopolitical implications going forward. Let's dig in. Hello, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you back on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So right now, Afghanistan seems to be all the focus, and there's a lot of debate about how it ended. But before we get into that, there's also been some people raising the issue of how it began. Some are saying that there wasn't a clear plan or an exit strategy. What's your take on that?
Well, it's hard to go back 20 years and try to remind everyone about the feelings and circumstances, politics, geostrategic relationships at the time. But we had just gone through a 2000 campaign where President-elect George W. Bush was talking about sort of reorienting great power politics and that we're going to get out of sort of the mini interventions that happened during the Clinton administration that resulted in the strike on the USS Cole, an accidental bombing of a milk powder plant, and some other kinds of issues that had come up, and focus more on rebalancing with Russia, taking a different approach to China. There was talk of a strategic competition moniker for the relationship. And so through much of the early parts of 2001, after the transition had occurred, there was lots of deputies committee meetings, principals committee meetings, exploring what these new relationships should be. We had an EP3 crisis with China. We had debate about the trade relationship with China. All of this was kind of the dominant narrative as we headed into the summer, which usually is when people go on vacation. It happened in 2001 as well. When we came back from that period, there were meetings about al-Qaeda. There was concern that some kind of an attack was being planned. We had an idea of who was planning it, but not necessarily where or how. In some ways, there was too much disparate information in order to really be ready or to thwart a specific attack. And so going into September 11th, there was a lot of concern. There was a lot of chatter in the system. There was meetings, there were plans. But it wasn't until that devastating day that it sort of knocked everyone back on their heels and realized that we had a geostrategic threat that reached the level of being a priority above all others. That's certainly the way President Bush saw it as he began to react to it. I was privileged to be in the White House before, during, and after 9/11 to sort of see these policies and plans coming into action and then changing dramatically and trying to be a part of the process to add a voice to how they should adjust. For those of us that followed Asia or the China challenge as a key priority, it was a little bit frustrating because the war on terror took a higher priority, and there was a good argument for that. It's hard for people 20 years later to remember the raw emotions and shock of that time. There was overwhelming support, bipartisan in the United States, but also among allies around the world, and standing in solidarity with the United States. The NATO alliance, for the first time, invoked Article 5 and said an attack on one was an attack on all. And so when you look back at how this all began, it's important to realize that there were several weeks taken to assess who did this, from where, and what could be done in response. The president retreated to Camp David, brought what was called his war cabinet together with him, but then the president deliberated and decided, and then they went forward, reached out to allies, engaged the United Nations, and announced the plans for the military response. When we look back on what that response was in October of 2001 and the sort of weeks and months that followed, that would be what an analyst might call a period of major military operations. That's where a massive deployment of material and troops go out. There was a very innovative approach of necessity taken to engage warlords on the ground. There was a mixture of intelligence operations and military operations that in a way that hadn't been done in previous conflicts. And so in some ways, our top national security people were trying different and innovative things because our military was built for the Cold War. It wasn't built for this new kind of war that we found ourselves in. But that early stage of major military operations would have to be viewed historically as a success. The Taliban government was displaced. Al-Qaeda was sent on the run. The failure in that scenario was Osama bin Laden escaping. And that is in many ways what led to the protracted campaign over the remaining years of the Bush administration and the early years of the Obama administration in the continued pursuit of Al-Qaeda's top leadership, and especially the perpetrators of 9/11. But that's kind of how things unfolded. It was shock, and then it was major military operations with clear consultation and participation among our allies, going in with the military objective to destroy those who enabled and attacked the United States and the alliance. And then from there, one can argue there was over time a shift of missions. There was an engagement that talked about writing constitutions, governing institutions, training the military there. It turned into what people would in mainstream parlance call nation building. We had somewhat of an occupying presence. Shepherded until 2004, there was an inauguration of President Karzai to be a democratically elected leader of a new country. So that's kind of the early stages in a nutshell from what my point of view was in the first term of the Bush administration 20 years ago.
As you mentioned at the time, the overwhelming consensus was that something needed to be done. Slowly through the years, as you mentioned too, the mission veered off course in a way. The mission changed. And so a lot of people have been mentioning that there's been calls to end this war for a really long time. And some are saying only President Biden was able to actually end it. So what's your take on that?
The world is not an on-off switch. It's not black and white. He had put forward what I think any reasonable person would say as a straw man argument between sort of escalating engagement of troops and extending the war versus a full retreat and immediate pullout without regard to order of battle, de-escalation, without regard to the order of operations in terms of helping civilians get out, helping Afghans who were our partners get out, and getting our diplomats out before drawing down troops too much. I think the most open, criticism that comes from almost every military and intelligence planner I have ever talked to is that the ceding of Bagram Air Base made no strategic sense until we were actually at the point of the final airlift. And so that order of things on the Biden withdrawal plan is different than President Bush would have ever contemplated. President Obama never contemplated it. President Trump never contemplated that order. That is 100% the Biden teams, after coming in and basically accepting a new deadline, not the one that was negotiated by President Trump, accepting a new deadline and a new set of interactions with the Taliban. This is what they chose, and I think any reasonable person knows that there's a lot of options between full-on war and full-on retreat, and the full-on retreat has been catastrophic. It's been catastrophic in terms of the human costs, which we're only beginning to understand and is only partly being reported. We seem to have confirmed we've even left behind U.S. government paid for journalists who work for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. We've left behind U.S. citizens and green card holders. We've left behind interpreters and others who work closely with American forces. While the withdrawal decision was understandable, the timing and sequence is unforgivable. It's been censured by the UK Parliament. It's been denounced by multiple allies. And of course, the most damning concern comes from people who have tried to flee Afghanistan, and partial families have come out, and they, with tears in their eyes, say, "We believed you, we trusted you, we worked with you, and you betrayed us and abandoned us." That is a death blow to American credibility in trying to work with others around the world in dangerous situations. I think it's tragic on a human level, but it's damaging on a strategic level too.
And you mentioned the word credibility, and some have been saying the biggest benefiters now are America's adversaries, and that China, the Chinese Communist Party, is the #1 that's benefiting. And part of that is some are mentioning Taiwan, that throughout this whole issue, allies have been looking to see how the U.S. is helping allies, say what happened in Afghanistan. And now a lot of people are mentioning Taiwan as the next one. What's your take on that?
We do know that for many, many decades now, they have placed a priority on taking Taiwan. They say it's about unification, but Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China. And in fact, it was considered to be non-essential territory in the early days of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. So we know that the eyes have been focused there. We know that China has had its wolf warriors seeking to try to take advantage and sow dissent among the free world in recent years in a very aggressive way. And so a demonstration of American weakness does embolden and empower aggressors. And so we have to be concerned about that. I think the people of Taiwan have a higher degree of resolve. There's also been some recent polling in the United States that suggests, while Americans are not hungry to engage in a military conflict, that there's a majority of Americans in public opinion that say that if the PRC were to take action against Taiwan, that America should stand by Taiwan and help defend Taiwan. That is a relatively recent showing in public opinion. I think it's driven more by negative views of the CCP than it's driven by positive views of Taiwan, even though from my point of view, those positive views of Taiwan are warranted. I think people are moved out of disgust and fear about the CCP.
And so on the international and geopolitical scale, how does the way the U.S. conducted this withdrawal from Afghanistan impact future ties, or does it?
Well, it does until something else is done to overcome the image this has conveyed. We live in a world that is defined by news cycles that are relatively short, where we live with times that are defined by hashtags that come and go over the course of a day. And so until something else is done to kind of redefine the leadership quality, staying power, and the sort of command presence of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America, until there's some new development to overtake this image, the overwhelming image is unfortunately of President Joe Biden leading on his binder in a very brief exchange with the press, with him sitting with his eyes closed during a meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, speaking with a halting and soft voice and sometimes incoherent pattern of speech in recent days. And then the images of people falling off of an American aircraft trying to leave, the images of someone hung from a helicopter in Afghanistan, and then recently the Taliban conducting a parade of what looks like American tanks and other material left behind. I think that the military risk is more of this material going across the border to Iran and who knows where from Iran than it is to China. But there's, I think, this symbol of weakness has to be overcome with something that is more dramatic. And it's hard to imagine what that would be. President Biden is not a commanding presence on the campaign trail. We're heading into tough negotiations on budgets and infrastructure. We're heading into a midterm election where his party looks on the verge of defeat. We have now had one full week where the average of polling across the United States has his disapproval above his approval. We call that being underwater. And this is a very early time for a president to be underwater in his term. So I think there's a lot of reasons for concern about waning American leadership. And perhaps most stinging, all the talk of America being back and alliances being in play. Some of those early European alliances that were supposed to be part of the propaganda campaign of America being back are the most vocal critics of how this was done. And some of them are footing the bill to try to evacuate their own personnel and try to come up with their own strategies for deterrence and diplomacy in an era of weakening American influence.
Biden mentioned that they're going to continue supporting the Afghan people and providing humanitarian aid, but some voices are saying it's too late. But going forward, what can the U.S. do now that it doesn't have a diplomatic presence there?
Well, it's extremely difficult to try to rationalize what they can do and what options they have now, given that they gave up very rational options by way of doing a lot of this backwards. If they really cared about giving aid and support to Afghan society, they should have been doing more of that before this collapse. If they really cared about supporting institutions and being prepared to make sure that aid and assistance doesn't go to terrorist organizations, we should have been establishing the receiving organizations in Afghanistan before this handover to the Taliban. There was an assessment that a collapse is imminent, and a mixture of terrorists and the Taliban, they're still on our terrorist list in the United States, and other terrorists are coming into power. And so how can we give aid into a war zone that is semi-governed by terrorists? I think that they've left themselves with very few safe avenues to govern. After this full collapse, it's really difficult to say what good options there are to ensure that any assistance isn't abused and actually enabling our enemies.
And some are saying the emboldened Taliban came as a result of the Trump deal last year. So what do you say about that?
There was a deal that the Trump administration established. I think it hasn't been reported in very much detail. I think it's a 6-page document. It's not the usual diplomatic gobbledygook that's hard to decipher. It's pretty clear. But what it was an establishment of a framework that said that we would put pressure on, but also give incentives for the existing government of Afghanistan and the Taliban to negotiate between themselves on coming to some kind of a power sharing agreement and an interim government that would help keep Afghanistan stable and safe through a transition period. But yes, the Taliban was a part of that negotiation, but it wasn't like the president of the United States had a summit with the incoming Taliban president. It was a framework agreement that was negotiated in a third country that basically said the United States would stand by and support a negotiated settlement between the existing government of Afghanistan and the Taliban as an undeniable political force in the country. The entire frame of reference is different now, and it's different because I think a very, very clear signal of provocative weakness was given, that the priority was on a date for withdrawal, and that the goal was to just withdraw all of our troops, to be able to declare a war over. It did not follow a conditions-based approach. We've ended wars and kept security presence behind. We've defeated ISIS for a time and still kept some security forces in play. We defeated Germany in World War II and kept troops there. You can go down the list. So there were options that were not put on the table by the Biden administration that were on the table by the Trump negotiators. It's understandable in American politics that partisans will reflexively try to come to the defense of their own side, but there's one commander-in-chief at a time. And even if you go back to 9/11, at the beginning of our conversation, President Bush was only in office for 8 months by the time 9/11 had come around. it would be unfair to say he was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And there were some people who would try to say it was the Clinton policies that enabled this to come into play. But there's only one commander-in-chief at a time. And once you're into the crisis and coming out of the crisis, it's only that president who is really legitimately judged as rising to the moment for leadership or failing in that moment of leadership.
And so I think you touched on this a little bit, but going forward, what are some things Americans can do? Maybe even just the average Joe at home. Is there anything Americans can do?
Well, the first thing that I would urge every American to do is to find people in their circle of contacts who have been veterans of the Afghanistan campaign. Directly, hopefully in person, thank them for fulfilling their mission. Thank them for serving us, our national interests, honoring our alliances, and doing it with distinction. There is a saying in the media and in our politics that it was the suits, not the boots, that failed in this end stage of this campaign. But those who have served, many of them have lost their sight, their hearing, limbs, suffer from PTSD, have lost friends and family through the course of this campaign. Engage them, thank them, support them, hold their spirits up. They served with honor. I think that is the single most important thing that we should do. In some ways, the leadership of our institutions have failed, but the people who gave it their all didn't fail, and we need to stand by them. Second, we need people to engage and hold our leaders in the public sphere accountable. Don't let them get away with trying to spin or whitewash or shift the subject away. When real travesty is before our eyes, we can see things for ourselves, we can hear things for ourselves. We should be pressing the media to be interviewing those who have fled Afghanistan to get more firsthand assessments of this is what was happening. The president said this was a tremendous success. We need to press for accountability. We need to press for the truth in that regard. But elections have consequences. In America, we have a lot of reasons to be disgusted with politics, with social media, with all of the kind of madness that is out there in public life. It would be reasonable for people to say, I want to withdraw and just live my own life and not deal with this. But there are consequences for withdrawing from the public sphere. There are consequences for being passive about elections. We have to vet our leaders, and we have to elect those that we have confidence with some reasonable demonstration of ability to lead our country and deal with crises like this. Because just about every president has an unforeseen crisis fall on their lap. Now we see the consequence of allowing an untested, unvetted leader become our commander-in-chief, and we can't let that happen again.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Take care.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Stephen Yates, former Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.